So, building directly off of some of what Bill has just said, we, in collaboration with Dr. Eric Klopfer, who I'll introduce in just a minute, have been working about how can we put different stakeholders in the shoes of others. You heard Bill just speak about how important it was to see the other side's perspective, and then let's just split the profits through all this, for example. How can you do that? So we, here at MIT, of course, enjoy quantifying. You heard me say how my heart just grew warm thinking about 45 screens of data, right? Going across and being all connected. So we love it, but not everybody is like us. We understand that at MIT. We're sad, but we understand that. So we're trying to find ways to use games to help people understand some of the basics of adaptive biomedical innovation and how the drug system really works. And so over the past 6 months, NewDigs has been collaborating with Professor Eric Klopfer's team at the MIT Scheller Teacher Education Program and the Education Arcade to bring ABI alive for students and people not like us who aren't as familiar with what drug development is like, so they can start to see what it all takes to get something from development to patients and the roles of all the players. And as we develop it more, it might be something we can use to help catalyze change in our organizations and across our community as well. So to start us off, Dr. Klopfer, if you'd come up and teach us a little about gaming for insight. Great to see you, Eric. Welcome back.
Okay, so thanks for having me here. I know this topic is a little out of the ordinary, but hopefully you'll see the way it connects with some of the themes that you guys are thinking about here. As Mark just mentioned, we've been working on this game, which we'll be talking about at the very end of this presentation, which is about new ways of biological discovery and drug approval. And our goal is to sort of be able to use some of the methods we've been using for helping people learn through games to be able to sort of affect change in the community here as well. So I'm Eric Klopfer. I run the teacher education program at MIT, which is our program that prepares MIT students who want to be math and science teachers. And the research that we do in my lab is primarily around educational games and simulations. So we do some things which are board games, we do things that are mobile games, we do things that are online games. We do stuff that's mostly around science, technology, engineering, math, mostly at the sort of secondary school level into university level, but we've done stuff with professional education, we've done stuff with really young kids as well. We try to think about different ways that we can use these media to affect learning. So a quick overview for today. I'm going to be talking just for about 20 minutes about the premise for why we do this kind of teaching and learning, why we think it's important, and then that will bridge into the specifics of the game that we've been developing. So I'm going to start off talking about learning in games and why we would do that at all. And then I'll talk about very briefly about these design principles that we have called resonant games and why and how we've come up with those principles for game design. And then I'm going to talk about the connection between the way we think about particular technologies and the affordances of those technologies and how we match those to different kinds of learning goals. In particular, I'll talk about one topic about data and learning games, coming off of the previous thing about machine learning, so how we use data, big data from games to help us understand the way people are learning and also to help them learn more effectively. And then we think about new technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality, and finally mobile, and how we think about the connections between those technologies and learning principles. Okay, whoops, there we go. So I'm going to talk about learning games now. So first of all, when I talk about learning in games, people have some very particular notions of what they think learning in games are. And so when they think of games, they often think of things like this, a first-person shooter. And these games are typically played in most people's minds by teenage boys in basements drinking Mountain Dew and eating Doritos. And there's some truth to that. And when people think about learning games, I say, okay, well, we need to, if we want to make really great learning games, we need to take the best games, the most popular games, and somehow make those educational. So you might take a game like this and have some sort of math question or physics question that's popping out of this guy's mind. How many volts he's going to need to kill 3 times 6 opponents. I just want to make it clear that this is not what we mean by games, and this is certainly not what we mean by learning games in our design process. Although there are many people out there who do actually take this approach, unfortunately. And I think the people who take that approach sort of have this idea of this is what the joy of gaming is, that if you look at a person playing a game, they should be throwing their hands in the air and smiling and being joyous and giggling and laughing. And that's what they think that gaming should look like, and they try to emulate that in the design of educational games. But in fact, this is what gaming looks like. This is from a photo essay that somebody did a number of years ago on faces of gamers as they were playing games. And you look at those faces, and those are very different than the ones on the last slide. These are not people throwing their hands in the air and having fun. Instead, they are what the emotion that people typically describe this as pleasantly frustrating. So they're pleasantly frustrated. And the idea is that you're a little bit perturbed by what's going on in this world, like you're not able to succeed perhaps, and then you overcome that, and that's where the pleasantness comes from. You succeed there. And this is my own daughter, in fact. A couple of years ago, there's a big conference here in Boston called PAX East. It's the big gaming conference on the East Coast. It is, going back to my previous notion of the boys in basements, it is mostly young adult males who are at this conference. My daughter is a younger, not adult female, and she has no idea who's around. Those men next to her, you can see the elbow there. That's not a perspective. They are literally twice as tall as she is. But she is so focused on that game that she doesn't know what's going on around her. But what she is, she's pleasantly frustrated, or having this idea of what's called hard fun. Seymour Papert, who was a famous professor at MIT, created the Logo programming language, among other things, early artificial intelligence expert, came up with this idea of hard fun. As he was watching kids doing programming activities in schools early on, he found that kids were having fun not in spite of what they were doing being hard, but because it was hard. You wrestle with a difficult problem, you have to come up with some answer to that, you maybe fail a number of times. Games sort of support that notion of easy failure, and then you can overcome that over time, and that's where the fun comes in. The fun comes in from your accomplishment, real accomplishments. So I have a number of principles that I describe to describe gaminess, and in some ways, we can think about these as design principles for games. In other ways, I think about them just as design principles for good learning environments. How do we actually foster learning and good feedback for learners in these different kinds of environments? And that goes, and when I say learners, that can be from toddlers on through adults in professional spaces. So I have these sort of 5 ideas in this space here. That create the structure of games. The first one is interesting decisions. Sid Meier, I don't know if any of you have played the game Civilization, but it's a very successful game about you run a civilization and try to take over the world, or do other things, as a matter of fact. But the idea is you live in sort of this world and you're a ruler. And within this game, you have to make a series of decisions. Now, they're interesting decisions because they're not simply like heads or tails on a coin. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know why you should make that decision. But an interesting decision has information coming in as to why you might make different kinds of decisions. So that's one of the interesting things that we can do in the design of these learning environments. There's consequences to those decisions. You might be sort of punished or rewarded as a result of things that you do in that space. You have clearly defined goals, and I make sure that word is plural, going back again to civilization. There are actually many ways to win the game of civilization. You can take over the world, you can win the space race, you can cause peace. There's all different ways that you can win. I think that's one of the great hallmarks of a good game, is there are many different ways that you can win, or there's many different ways you can succeed. There's visible, measurable feedback. Sometimes people think about this as score. You're getting some sort of metric about how you're doing, but in fact, good games provide multiple metrics. You might have score, you might have wealth, you might have health, you might have the amount of gear that you've collected within this world. All those things sort of can signal to you how you're doing within that space. And finally, there's some sort of underlying model or system. In a lot of the things that we do, there's an actual simulation. There's a biological simulation, a physical simulation, a social simulation that underlies the system. Other cases, it can be simply a set of good set of rules that you have in there. And I won't go through this, but I don't really sort of draw a line, this is a game or not a game. That's why I have this phrase gaminess, but rather sort of things exhibit different amount of characteristics within that space. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to talk about our idea of these resonant games, just real briefly. For many years, we've done a lot of game design within my lab, and we've distilled this down to a sort of set of principles that we think about within the design of educational games. The first of those principles is designing for the whole learner, which means that we don't think about the person as a person in my class for these 40 minutes that are working on this subject, but rather that person has interests, that person has friendships, that person has hobbies, that person is part of some sort of community. We think about all those factors when we're designing for somebody. So in fact, we want to think about what are the kinds of, if this game is being played by a certain age group, what are the kinds of interests those people might have, and how might we relate to those things? We design for communities. Whoops, there's a little mistake here, but we design for communities. There's a repeat here, but we think about the sociality of learning as part of that. So we think about how do they work with other people within those spaces. So this is not a game that you typically play in solitary, but a game you play as part of some community. We design for knowledge, skills, and practices. Again, going back to that original notion of the way that people think about educational game design, they often think about it just for knowledge. You need to learn your multiplication tables. You need to learn the elements of the periodic table. It's about a knowledge that you need to accumulate. But rather, we also think about things like skills and practices. So there might be certain skills within your domain that you need to think about. There might be professional practices you need to think about. These are things we think about across the board that we think are important to learn. In many ways, the knowledge is actually the least important to think about within the game space, and that the skills and practices are the most important. Sometimes the skills and practices then in turn either rely on knowledge or in fact help you build the knowledge. But the skills and practices are the things that the games do really well. And finally, we think about designing for society. We think about the ways that these games sort of impact people outside of school, the ways that you can impact a larger community. Sometimes it's about the benefits of these games for sort of creating a greater sense of good. So we think about all those principles as we're doing our design. We also think about the game as only one part of a system. So it's not that the game is sort of a black box where you sort of put somebody into it, and on the other side they come out knowing something, but rather the game is part of a system, and you learn through that entire system. So we think of the game as an experience. This is actually the action reflection cycle. It's typically thought of as things you do in outdoor sort of experiential education, where you might sort of have to go get a whole bunch of people over a wall or something like that, and you fail a number of times, and you realize you have to do it as teamwork and things like that. In this case, the experience is the game, and then you think about the resources and reflection that go with that. So in many cases, the game might leave you with some ideas you might be wondering, but in fact, when you associate that with reflection that you might do as a group and additional resources and instruction, that's where the learning comes to play. And this typically happens as a series of cycles, not just you do once, but you actually do multiple times. Okay, so next thing I'm going to talk about is some of the technology affordances. I'm going to start with some of the stuff around big data and how we think about data from games, and then talk about some specific technologies. So data and learning games. So we designed a game a few years ago. This is just one example. I thought it was a good concrete example. We designed a game a number of years ago called the Radix Endeavor. It's a massively multiplayer online game about biology and mathematics. It was developed with funds from the Gates Foundation. And this is kind of what it looks like. You have a character within a world. You have a series of quests that you need to go on. The premise of this particular game is that you're a part of some underground society in a Renaissance-like era in an Earth-like world, trying to use science to make the world a better place. We have both biological and mathematical models. This is some of the biological models here. There's a whole series of genetics quests that you have to do within this world, among other things. There's something about human body systems you have to learn about. There's stuff about ecology and evolution what you have to do within this world as well. But each one of those is based on that some sort of system, some sort of model underlying it, like I was talking about in my idea of gaminess. In this case here, it's a genetic system. As you go through that model, though, as you go through it and experience with that system, we've designed it so that you're not just sort of like doing things and sort of in any sequence you want, but rather there's a certain sequence of things that we think we've designed to the system that will be more helpful for you making the discoveries that you need. So we've been very specific about the way we've designed the tasks in this world so that we can sort of elicit things that we think students might be misunderstanding within that world, and very clear things that they would be understanding, and have very clear indicators in those cases what they would be doing. So we've used this process called experiment-centered design. It's a variant on this idea called evidence-centered design, where you're very specific about the things that you're asking people to do within learning systems, and very specific about the outcomes that you're expecting within those systems. we've done a lot of research then in terms of the data that comes out of this. In this case, we're not just sort of like, as my colleague Justin Reich has said, fishing in the exhaust of data that's coming out of these systems, but rather we have very specific hypotheses about what people have done and based on the kinds of systems that we've created here. So this is one that's actually just looking at the different kinds of ways that people can use the genetics tools within the genetic system to come up with solutions to the problems that they have. And we've actually, if you look here, there's 2, 4, 6, there's 7 different sort of terminal nodes here in this tree, but people can sort of make different branching decisions and end up in different places. And 2 of those actually turn out to be pretty successful places, so people can succeed by choosing 2 very different pathways. And there's lots of other pathways that are much less successful or never successful. In some ways we can just sort of determine, like we can then look at, see, like if people are headed down this pathway, they're probably on the right track, and we can sort of leave them alone. If people are sort of headed down one of the other pathways where they seem to be, where there's no chance of success, we can then sort of push them in the right direction, give them some sort of prompt, help them think about what they might be doing better in those cases. So these are some of the ways that we think about data that we can use from these systems to both understand what people are doing inside of them and what they're learning, as well as to help them learn along the way. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some of the other technologies that we think about here. So, and I've chosen these 3. We've used many technologies over time. I've chosen these 3 because these are some of the more current and interesting technologies. So one of them is virtual reality and augmented reality. I put them along this spectrum here. This is a pretty known, well-known spectrum from reality to virtual reality, where you have at one end of the spectrum things that are entirely real, and the other end of the spectrum being things that are entirely virtual. And in between are these sort of mixes of things. And then I also have on the other scale here on this spatial scale from tabletop to landscape. And this is a whole large space of us thinking about ways that we can use different technologies to foster different kinds of learning. And what we try to do is think about what are the affordances of, say, for example, augmented reality at the building scale or virtual reality at the room scale. What are the things that those could help? And then how do we think about matching those to those different domains? So I'm going to just give a brief example here, virtual reality. I won't talk too much about these affordances, but I've defined sort of 5 different important characteristics of virtual reality: immersion, perspective, interaction, sensation, and spatial representation. These are things that I think that virtual reality does uniquely well, and we think about designing learning environments that draw upon these principles. Those can in turn learn to particular kinds of applications. One of those is in 3D structure. If you think about things like molecular molecules, enzymes, proteins, and the way we can represent those in virtual reality that draw upon some of those things like 3D structure. And the other is scale. As we think about things, as you move in virtual reality, you can get a sense of scale and relative scale of things. We've used that latter principle of scale in a project we call Clever. Which is about cellular biology at this point. And so we're using virtual reality to help students understand cellular biology, and particularly based around this concept of scale. So within the cell, there are things that happen at different scales, and yet in many ways, in most textbooks, the representations sort of seem to exist on the same scale. One of the outcomes of this has been to help students also understand what do cells really look like. And in many cases, in textbooks, they typically look like things more on the left, which are more sparsely populated. But in fact, they are very dense and filled with stuff. And so in fact, in working around these spaces, they have to understand that idea of cells as being really densely packed places. I'll briefly then talk about augmented reality up here. A similar set of principles here. This is more generally for mobile devices. There's this idea of portability, social interactivity, context sensitivity, connectivity, and individuality. Sort of different set of principles when we think about in virtual reality. And that leads to different kinds of applications. One of those sets of applications has been around sort of this landscape scale scenarios. This is one we did many years ago here at MIT for some of our environmental engineering students at MIT to get them to understand the idea of bringing together sort of data that they collect in the field with data that they can research. And it was a game about a fictional chemical disaster on the MIT campus that they're able to use these tools to research. And they play out as if it's real. So if they really want to know like what's happening here down in Killian Court at MIT, they have to go down there and they can use virtual scientific equipment to take samples from the soil, et cetera. We've done things more recently in zoos and gardens and museums with the same kind of things here. We did one with the Columbus Zoo around the illegal wildlife trade. So the last thing I'll talk about is the stuff we're doing in mobile, and that will lead into the RX game here. We've called these participatory simulations, and recently we call them Wormhole Academy. The idea is that these are sort of lightweight mobile technologies that sort of take you into a scenario, into a system that you're interacting with other people in. And that gives you the ability to sort of have a simulation while you're also interacting with other people in real time. So it's about collaborative problem solving, and we try to do it in a way that's both scalable and shareable. The very first game that we did in this was many years ago. I think maybe 20 years ago we did this. As you can see up there, that's on Palm Pilots. There's a more web-based version up here on the bottom that gives you a sense. There's actually a version that goes before the Palm Pilots, which was on custom wearable hardware that was developed at the Media Lab. But the idea is in these games is that you go around and you meet people in the game, and you collect a list of the other people in the class. But unbeknownst to you, there's a virus getting passed around that somebody started with. And some people are getting sick over time, and you have to ultimately determine, like, why did some people get sick and not others, and what determined the order of people getting sick. And the class sort of has this initial goal of an individual goal of sort of just keeping themselves well, and then it quickly turns into a problem of, like, how do we solve this scientific problem? How do we conduct experiments to understand what went on in this system? We have another more recent game using a platform that Paul developed back there it's built on a system called Game Blocks. It's a game called Energio. It's a game about climate change. Just to give you a sense of what it looks like, most of the time people are up and around in the class interacting with other real people. Scanning, you sort of convey information by scanning another person's phone. There's group work where you sort of have to work in teams, and you have a computer that sort of compiles some of the information in that space. And then you get to see what happens at a whole class level. You can see outcomes here. In this case here, the glass is doing OK. They haven't killed the Earth yet. And I'll skip this video for now. But when you look at a class full of these people, it looks like a little bit like organized cacophony. So people are trying desperately to try to solve problems, working with each other, and thinking about how they might come up with solutions. In this case here, in many cases, it's a tragedy of the commons scenario, and people end up killing the Earth in an initial scenario. And the idea is through collaboration, through sort of incentives that they can provide within this system, can they actually make it so that it benefits each person individually and still keeps the system alive. So that bridges into RX, which is our most recent game in this domain. It's a pharma sim game. It's about the process of sort of drug discovery and approval. The idea here is that there's different players representing different roles within a system. The goals are in conflict, much as I described in the previous example here. But the idea is through collaboration, there's ways that you can make everybody benefit. You have a sense of a shared score that gives you a sense of how you're doing, but you also have a sense of how you are doing as an individual within this space. The idea is you're sort of trying to move a drug through the approval process, and you have to think about all the different players that are within the system and how they're served or not served by this. And each person can make decisions individually, but those decisions cascade and they can cascade down the line in terms of the other people that are within the system and how that affects them. In many cases, the personal, as I mentioned, the personal and the system goals are in conflict. And the question is then, how do you create systems that better align those things, where the individual benefits and the system level benefits can be more well aligned? I'm kind of going through this quickly, mostly just to sort of set up the scenario. You'll see more of this in about 1 minute in a video that we'll present here. And it's very much a social situation. And then just like the previous one I mentioned, there's an opportunity to sort of like try and to fail. We want to have this idea of low cost of failure. It's OK to fail within one of these systems here. There's not real people suffering as a result of the drugs being approved or not approved. But in fact, you can learn through this sort of safe systems where you can learn about what's happening and learn about how you can actually treat the system differently and get a chance to do it again and try again. The goal here, again, is not to necessarily say like there's a specific facts that you need to learn about within this, that the game isn't trying to convey those. The game is giving you a scenario to play with, and through that scenario you can help discover what are the sort of key aspects that help these systems work or fail. OK, so is the audio hooked up to this as well? OK, so I will. Does the video need another introduction as well, or should I just play the video first?
So let me just say one or two things about this. So in our motivation, we were trying to use some of Eric's terms to have it be hard fun and have people understand the frustration of the current drug development through market access challenges. So he talked very much about the regulator interaction. You also see the payers are involved with this. So for you to win as a group of these players, you have to not only win from each stakeholder perspective, but also get drugs actually to patient use at the end of the day through all this. And the first round is the very somewhat frustrating, this is how we do it today. And then in the second round, through greater collaboration and information sharing and resolving uncertainty over time, you'll see sort of contingent approval built into this. You will see better outcomes, perhaps, through all this. This is just one game scenario that is being put together, and it's being targeted at the moment to those who aren't deeply engaged themselves in drug development and access. So it's very simplified in this initial version. Perhaps over time, with greater development, we'll make it even more realistic, and it can really be a systems change and a way for us to bring collaborators like yourselves together to really play through different kinds of scenarios. But right now, it's more of an education and a teaching tool to raise awareness amongst those who aren't as deeply embedded in this process as us, but help them share our frustration and joy through this whole thing. So with that, Eric, please.
RX is a pharmaceutical development and patient access game. 5 players each take a stakeholder role. The patient, the prescriber, the sponsor, the regulator, or the payer. They'll interact with each other to move a drug all the way from initial development to patient use. Just like their real-life counterparts, each player has different abilities and a different goal.
I want to get a successful drug on the market.
I want to make sure that the available drugs are safe and beneficial.
I want to prescribe effective drugs to my patients.
I want to make sure those drugs are beneficial in the long term.
I just want a treatment that fits my needs.
Let's take a look at round 1, which is based on the typical drug development process. In the first round, the sponsor starts by researching a drug for rheumatoid arthritis. The more time she spends on research, the more she knows about the drug's benefits and risks, but the less time the drug has on the market to make a profit.
So I don't know exactly how common the side effects are, but these data ranges aren't too bad. I will pass it on to the regulator and see what they say.
Now the regulator decides whether to approve the drug and what populations to approve it for. Unbeknownst to anyone else, the regulator has a table that shows them what levels of side effects they are willing to tolerate. If they approve a drug with too high an incidence of side effects, it puts them at risk of disciplinary action, and they could lose points.
I don't know, it might be too risky. You're gonna have to do more research.
Meanwhile, the prescriber is trying to match drugs to patient cases. Since the sponsor's drug wasn't approved, she can only use the middlingly effective generics that are already on the market.
These really aren't very effective for my patients that are worst off. Maybe I'll have to start prescribing it to patients in earlier stages?
The prescriber matches available drugs to patient cases. It's up to the player representing the patient to decide in each case whether to take the drug. He knows how much they're willing to pay, whether they're willing to take an injectable, and so on.
These ones look okay, but this medication is just way too hard to take. You're gonna have to prescribe another one. I'm passing this one back.
But there isn't anything else.
Well, who's holding this up? The regulator? I'm gonna call my congressman.
I'm still waiting to hear back from the sponsor.
Too late.
The patient uses his special ability to censure the regulator, damaging her reputation and costing her points. Meanwhile, the sponsor is finishing her trials.
It took a while, but now we have much more data. So will you approve it?
Okay.
Now the new drug is on the market, so the prescriber can prescribe it to patients. But the players are running out of time in the round.
Here, hurry.
Got it. Please say you'll pay for it.
I'm not sure it's beneficial in the long run.
I will totally call my congressman on you.
Okay, fine.
and it isn't an injectable, so I'll take it. Points for me.
Me too.
Okay, fine, but can you speed up the prescriptions? I need to make more of a profit.
Oh, time's up.
Okay, how did we do?
All of the stakeholders made some progress towards their personal goals and got points for doing so, but could have done a little better.
I wanted to assign prescriptions to more cases, but a lot of times the available drugs just wouldn't work. So I actually spent a lot of time just waiting for new drugs to come out.
A lot of those problems stem from a lack of transparency around stakeholders' competing goals.
If I'd known what level of side effects you'd be willing to tolerate, I probably would have done some more research before submitting the drug to you.
Yeah, it would have saved us a lot of time if we didn't have to go back and forth.
And that would have gotten me the treatments I needed even faster.
Which ultimately would have gotten more points for all of us.
The group also has a shared score that represents the general well-being of the market and the population. For every patient treated, this score goes up, but it goes down for every untreated patient.
If it gets any lower, it'll be game over for all of us.
We really need to get those drugs out faster, maybe in round 2.
Round 2, the ABI round, changes the play by sharing information between players. The players try to achieve their goals as before, but this time there's more transparency.
Okay, so these are the risk thresholds I'm willing to take.
Oh, good to know.
The sponsor also has the option of sharing information earlier.
My trials aren't done, but this is looking really promising.
Okay, send it over and I'll have a look. Okay, the data looks pretty good for the advanced stages, but you're going to need to collect some more for the earlier ones.
Can you approve it for stage 4 while I finish my trials?
Yeah, but you're going to need to collect data from the stage 4 patients first.
Done.
As a result, the new drug is available earlier for those who need it most.
Oh, I have so many cases this will help. If you can take the time to submit data.
Absolutely.
Meanwhile, the sponsor is finishing up her trials.
Data sent.
Looks good. Let's roll it out for stages 1 through 3.
Can you cover that for a stage 2 patient?
With those numbers, absolutely.
The end result? Drugs are available earlier, allowing patients to get the treatment they need sooner, and the sponsor to have a more successful drug. The results improve scores for all the stakeholders, as well as the well-being of the general population.
I started recouping my costs sooner, so I didn't feel like I had to charge as much.
Which I really appreciated.
Me too. I mean, we knew more and we had better prices, so we could cover it in a lot more cases.
I really prefer being transparent about our drug and safety requirements rather than bouncing the drug back and forth until we got it right.
And I didn't have to wait as long for effective drugs to hit the market, so I could actually treat a lot more cases.
Yeah.
Which would really be good for all of us. Can we see our shared score?
So I just want to thank the sponsor and the regulator who were back there, as well as the narrator as well, and Paul, who was assigned the behind the scenes on development. So.
Didn't we make the payers look nice in that video? So you see the kind of interaction and fun that we can have with these. And it was also, if you notice, there was a mobile handheld game. So you can imagine it being played and not stuck around a table, but wandering around a conference room and talking to each other and sharing some information back and forth. We really have great enthusiasm for where this could go to raise both awareness generally amongst those not associated with it, but you can see the potential of how it could start to help in these situations where we get various players within a room, literally players in our industry, and have them play the game together and gain a little more appreciation for what the other groups are having to go through. But games aren't the only way that we're working to try to bring some of this learning and the simulation and tools together. And while we're not MITRE with 42 screens, we are thinking of a few things along the way. But first, let's talk about the different types of models. And this is the Trusheim hierarchy of models, if you will, where you have physical ones, which are actually remarkably important, but often not talked about very much. But physical models can be really important. Frameworks are a type of model. The FDA framework for how one should develop a drug or a companion diagnostic through is a really important sense-making model for what one should strive for. Then we have these instructional and educational games, just like the brilliant one you just saw developed here with Dr. Klopfer's team throughout, called RX. Next are what we often use, and all of us in various forms seem to use almost every day or month within our roles, which are what I call them single perspective simulators. They look at one particular element from one particular perspective. This one happens to be a clinical trial simulator from one of our partners that we've worked with, but it only looks at how would a sponsor design a trial to do some endpoint, and look at those sorts of things together. But then you have real system simulations. And this is some simulation of systems biology done by a couple people here at MIT, which connects literally all the genomics, proteomics, and pathways information, as well as disease etiology information, to start simulating perturbations at one point in the network, how that would flow through, and how combinations might help. A real system, multi-perspective, multi-data set tools to help build new insights that any one of those perspectives alone could not generate through all that. So out of those models and those levels, let's talk about the advanced ones, the multi-perspective, or some of the really large ones. The military does big wargaming sorts of things. In the past year alone, they asked for $55 million just for a couple of these naval and other sorts of war simulations down in the Pentagon going forward. Urban planning, remarkable broad data collection being done. The view on the top right that you see, where you see the little red stripes, that's where carbon monoxide gets concentrated in the city because of traffic patterns. Overall, they're fine, but if you look at how the buildings are tall and the bus routes are set up, et cetera, this is where air pollution gets concentrated in certain urban canyons within this city, and how they might have to move to other sorts of transportation modalities or other electric vehicles to try to eliminate that. Climate change is perhaps one of the most famous sets of large-scale modeling systems that go on for complex and adaptive systems. You had the game that Eric was talking about. Here there's a series of models within that community that go from fairly localized climate factors to very global and large scale. And the map of the United States that you see with the different gradations, it shows about 3 orders of magnitude improvement in the granularity of the scale by which the community has moved over the past 5 years to simulate how climate change happens over years, but at geographical concentration and granularity to make those more accurate over time to help give better policy choices in front of us. And then you heard me talk about the genomics and the omics things. However, for healthcare systems that we've been talking about, no such model exists. We cannot connect early development decisions with payer access decisions with how should a prescriber think about their populations at all. You saw Gigi earlier bring up this sort of sandbox framework, right, of who are all the stakeholders. We want the patients to win most and everybody to win at least enough through all this. And as we've talked through today, and as we've seen in many places in conversations elsewhere, there are a phenomenal number of magic silver bullets that people think are going to solve our challenge from left to right. Right? Some of them are huge silver bullets. Let's do get real world evidence, for example. Others are very narrow. Let's do some application to collect patient-reported outcome on gait off of their Apple Watch. Right? There's all sorts of these applications from the early stage of precision medicine and genomics information collection across large populations, all the way to the right-hand side of new kinds of innovations in contracting and performance-based kinds of arrangements. But each one of those we think of in isolation. We have to find ways to connect those individual true breakthroughs, I think you called them inventions, right? And tie them into an innovation system together through all this, and have some abilities that we say, if we combine 4 of these in this particular way, do they really work together in a manner that changes the system dramatically, or not at all, or even harms where we're trying to get to? So in this sandbox, we've been beginning to put some tools within the sand. So some of those have been the frameworks. You saw here the 3-layer cake that Gigi talked about before. In our focus project, we have some frameworks. There are other frameworks that we use that help make some sense, and that in some sense will underlie many of these other more quantitative models that we hope to bring forward. You just saw the ABI game, the RX game that's been developed. Helpful for building intuition, for help building appreciation for what has to happen, but it's not the kind of climate change model that we were talking about before. We have some tools that we've developed and prototyped to help stakeholders begin to understand each other's positions better. Those of you who are bioinformaticians see that it looks like a heat map, right? But those heat maps are not of genetic things. Those are stakeholder perspectives on issues. And where do they agree or disagree with whether a product should be approved or move forward in things. And what it has allowed us to do at least once or twice is show different stakeholders, well, you agree on about half of these issues, or 2/3, let's talk about the places where you don't, and help move them forward in much more productive ways, much more quickly through this. We've done some simulation of registries if multiple sclerosis is now published work, and we discovered by looking at the real data underneath, if you can see that most multiple sclerosis patients, you see red lines and they only get worse as they go up through that scale. You will see that there are some green lines towards the bottom. It appears that there is actual improvement that happens amongst MS patients over time. What this kind of visualization and simulation work showed us, we did some fancy math and regressions to work through about 15 to 18,000 registry patients in Sweden on multiple sclerosis, is either the data registry is calling people incorrectly because they shouldn't be getting better, and we have data problems through that, or there's actually some wonderful drugs or spontaneous remissions beginning to happen, at least over time, through some of these MS patients. They're now looking through that data to figure out which of those 2 or 3 possibilities are actually happening. They suspect it's some drug treatment in the early stages that's really helping people improve and stabilize. We have some disease-modifying treatments, and we're seeing evidence of that. Then we get to a real ABI beginning of a development model, which we did with NICE. They were very helpful in partnering with us for over a year and providing a full-time brilliant programmer, Joost de Valter, to work on this, where we combined both that single simulation approach for a clinical trial with multiple financial models for payers, developers, and the patients through this. And we looked at the entire evidence development pathway, not just one trial, but about 8 trials together in a full pathway along with a registry and along with the population split to see how this whole system might have worked for Gilenya if you had developed that product not under the classic approach but under the ABI approach. And we demonstrated you would have found the safety issues with Gilenya faster with about half the actual harmed patients put at risk through all that. So it was a great success, but it's still only a partial solution to all this. And we're also now beginning to take this from individual product levels to full portfolios. We have an effort going on in our focus project where we're looking at the entire gene therapy pipeline and what are its financial implications for the system and how one might use financial engineering and other kinds of performance-based contracting approaches to mitigate some of the harms of the surges that one might see on gene therapy patients coming through, so we can both bring these products forward faster, but still make them financially feasible for the payer community at the same time. So these are the sorts of tools and things that we're beginning to build. They're stepping stones along the way, but they're nowhere close to where you might think some of the other more developed regions that we're at, whether that be on the military side, the genomics side, the climate change side. We're nowhere close to that kind of modeling, but we believe we're beginning to make some steps along the way through all that. But there's much yet to be done in our sandbox. This is from the Revere Beach, a world-renowned sandcastle building contest. So by all working together, we hope to develop some really cool, large successes in our sandbox together. So that's where we hope that you see there is phenomenal opportunity to help catalyze system change through bringing together some of these tools with leaders like yourself to try out some of the ideas that Bill suggested of how you align incentives and change systems by understanding each other's perspectives and pre-trying out what some of those actions might be. And we think tools like these might be really helpful in that process, and we build them into our design labs along the way. So I have 1 minute and 47 seconds for any questions for me, or more importantly, for the designers and developers of our games and Eric Klopfer. Jane.
So these 2 days have been amazing, and my mind is totally blown now. And yesterday I sort of was okay. But we seem to be moving back and forth between drug development and health, learning healthcare systems. And I think that it's really important that we be clear which the goal is. They're not totally sympathetic. You know.
So our view here at New Digs, Jane, is that our view here is that drug development is only the first left-hand side of the learning healthcare system, and that it needs to be part of it. It's no longer separate, and you may disagree with that.
Well, actually, I think that there are some things about drug development that are antithetical to healthcare improvement, and that's one of the things that I think where there might be a disconnect, that because where our systems are designed to get drugs to market as opposed to improving health of patients. So that may or may not be true.
Yes, you're correct. And I think that our view still is, for the most part, despite Bill's inspiring talk, right, we're mostly in the health care, sick care environment is where we're focused. We're not doing very much really in the wellness or the keeping or the true health system. Inspired by Bill, but he was pushing us into aspirations that we don't quite have yet. But we applaud him for the work that he's succeeding at.
Let me maybe turn to Eric a little bit. My recollection, and this is very brief, is that when Obamacare was sort of being discussed, there were some simulations that were given to Congress people to talk about sort of all of these kinds of trade-offs. And I don't know where that went, but I don't, although I see regulators.
I'm holding my tongue about the current Congress and the use of any such models.
I see regulators, but I don't see public policy. And if we're really talking about learning health systems, it's much bigger than just drug regulators. So
yes.
That's one thing that is concerning to me, but it's already so big, and would be interested in your thoughts on. And I think there are things about, for example, OHRP, that prevent us from sort of melding research and healthcare. So
yes.
That's just one.
And thank you for pushing us, and that's exactly where we want to be going, is blending both the other. And John, I'm going to have to ask you not this time, okay, because I'm out of time. All right, and we need to stay fairly close.